This episode of the American Academy of Optometry Foundation's clinical podcast series is presented by CooperVision.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the AAOF's clinical podcast series. My name is Andrew Pucker. I am today's host and topical editor for this episode. I'm an optometrist who's a fellow, and I am currently the Chief Development Officer at Mintra Health. Today we have with us a special guest, Karen Walsch. Could you please, Karen, introduce yourself?
Yep, absolutely, Andrew. And thank you for inviting me to come on and talk today. So I'm Karen Walsch, also an optometrist, also a fellow, and first author of the paper that we're going to be talking through. I spend my time, having spent prior years both in clinical practice and in contact lens research. I now spend my time in the Global Professional Affairs team for CooperVision, where I head up a team of four of us in that team and working with our regional professional affairs to lead our education for our customers.
Awesome. So we have the perfect person here today. As Karen said, she is the author of this paper. So Karen published a topical review in Optometry and Vision Science, and it's a review of the 25 years of silicone hydrogel contact lenses. So for those of you who don't know, it's one of the two main, materials that we would use in our contact lens practice, at least for soft contact lenses. Karen, could you maybe just give us a little overview of why you decided to write this paper and some key points about SiHys and why they're maybe different or better potentially than maybe hydrogels or other materials out there?
So 25 years felt like a bit of a landmark moment to take that pause and look back. It's a quarter of a century. I can say that all of the authors, the five authors on the paper, all of us are old enough to have practiced without silicone hydrogel. So we've seen the introduction into our clinical practice and throughout that period of time. And it just felt like a good place to put that line in the sand and say, what have they done for how we might be approaching clinical contact lens fitting for our patients? Where are they performing really well? How are they evolved over time? And also just to ask that question, what's coming next and what else do we need to continue to develop and solve?
That's perfect. So if I'm remembering right, SiHys were introduced roughly in 1999, and they may not have actually taken off quite like people had expected. So what did you kind of find in your reviews of literature on that?
You're absolutely correct. And it was a little bit of a slower start. The initial development for silicone hydrogels was intended to increase oxygen transmissibility through the contact lens material to the cornea, of course. We know the hydrogel material, there's a theoretical limit on how much oxygen that you can have passing through that material to reach the cornea. It's relying on dissolving in the water phase of that hydrogel. Absolutely, when we look to rigid contact lens technology, those materials for a number of years, it's been known if you incorporate either fluorine or silicon into those monomers, you can increase oxygen transmissibility. It was wanted and desired to be able to try and do that in a soft lens. It presents from a development point of view a real technical difficulty. Silicon is famously extremely hydrophobic. It's got a rubber kind of base. It doesn't like water. And we need to get that combined into a hydrophilic, water-loving material that can be wettable in the eye. So there was a real technical challenge to doing it, even though it was desired and wanted to be developed for a long time. And those very first contact lenses you mentioned that got released in around the turn of the century were developed with an eye for very high oxygen transmissibility, which they achieved, 175 dK/T for one of those lenses. But there was an eye also on developing those lenses for continuous or overnight extended wear. Can we get a lens supplying loads of oxygen that someone can sleep in without needing to think about it for a month? So their original release was a little more sort of curtailed around that kind of aim. They took a little while to sort of develop in those materials to become a little bit more sort of wider spread, I think, over time.
Yeah, so they were revolutionary at the time, and they still are. They're an amazing material. But could you maybe talk about some of the maybe incremental changes they made to SiHys to make them more adaptable or more naturally able to interact with the eye?
It's a really good point. You know, those very first ones, we were able to shoot up those levels of oxygen transmissibility. By doing so, we found that those materials had very relatively low water content, and that change in the balance of those properties led you to a lens that had a higher modulus, was a stiffer lens than we were used to within our soft lens hydrogel experience. So over time, what's happened? Well, balancing of properties was a really important change and evolution that's happened when we look back at that history. When we get to about 2004, we see the introduction of the first lens that was designed not for overnight wear, but for daily wear. And what that was allowed it to do was to balance out, well, we don't need quite as much oxygen coming through that contact lens all the time. We're still a significant step up from hydrogels. So we can balance how this lens handles, we can balance its water content and its oxygen transmissibility. So you find that you have something now that's a little softer, much more sort of user-friendly. And that evolution over time really helped to explode the use of lenses for daily wear and obviously offer that now to many more patients. We saw then gradually, as development continued, increasing introduction of a wide range of spherical prescriptions that could be corrected, of course, followed by toric prescriptions, multifocals, and then more recently, both in monthly and actually now in daily disposables, and toric multifocals are available as well. So we have the optical correction choice available, and we have a wide range of materials that are comfortable, have great modulus, good handling, and still allow oxygen to pass through to the cornea.
It was really exciting when I was in optometry school. The first daily disposable SiHy came out, and it really, I think, accelerated this category. And now, would you say it's the majority of soft lenses prescribed, or is it like half and half with hydrogel, the other older material, or where do you think we're at right now?
So really interesting. In terms of the material that is prescribed in soft lenses, the majority by far is silicone hydrogel. When we look at fits and refits, the international prescribing report that comes out in Contact Lens Spectrum every year, we tend to have about sort of 78% of those soft fits are into silicone hydrogel materials. When you then start to break that down by the modality, the replacement frequency of those lenses, it's kind of still roughly about half and half. So when I say that, about half of them are daily disposables on average, and the other half are made up of a reusable, but being that monthly to weekly.
Cool. So I think there were a lot of hopes when we were creating these SiHys, and I think some of them were maybe to decrease microbial keratitis, decrease comfort issues. Kind of how have been the outcomes with these lenses? So we know they have some great properties, but what are some good things that have happened, and maybe what are some things that we could grow in this technology too?
So you've heard me mention a couple of answers so far, oxygen a number of times, and that really is the big tick in the box. So the oxygen delivery capabilities of these materials have all but eliminated any hypoxic effects that we see from our patients wearing contact lenses for long hours during the day and for many years of wear over their lifetime. As I said to you before, I've practiced before the introduction of silicone hydrogel materials, and it was commonplace with a hydrogel wearing patient who maybe a higher prescription, long hours of wear, and you would be modulating their wear time. You would see some changes to the cornea, you might see some neovascularization, you might see some additional limbal redness, and you would be asking them to take their lenses out early in the evening and swap the glasses to give their eyes a break. What we have now is material that allows plenty of oxygen through to the eye, no matter what the material is in the SiHy category. And it means that we can allow our patients to wear their lenses for as long as their lifestyles demand during the day. So that freedom is something we shouldn't take for granted. And we know that we've really solved those hypoxic sequelae and complications that we used to see. Big tick in that box. Where we learned along the way that we had hopes for, can we increase comfort? It seems logical. You increase oxygen, can we increase comfort? And I think still there's actually a misconception out there that is the case. The literature review that we did, and we pulled that evidence together, reminded us that actually just increasing oxygen doesn't increase comfort automatically. So you don't actually have that uplift. Comfort itself, we understand in a contact lens is multifactorial, driven by so many different factors. So perhaps it's not surprising that just increasing oxygen alone wasn't going to make a big difference, but that is the case. And in fact, really, while we're talking about comfort, the most comfortable way to wear a contact lens, and we do have some evidence for it, is if we switch to something that you put in fresh every day. So a daily disposable does actually come out in research a little more comfortable than reusing a contact lens. So we do have that, and we do know that, and we can use that to help advise our patients. The other hope, of course, if we increase oxygen, can we reduce infections, the risk of infection, and in particular, the sight-threatening infection of microbial keratitis. Now, again, the evidence building up over the early years of silicone hydrogel use, some really great studies that were done, the large population-based studies. We still have about the same incidence of microbial keratitis, whether we're talking hydrogel, silicone hydrogel material, and actually equally if we're talking reusable to daily disposable. So we haven't yet, as a profession, as an industry, from an academic point of view, we haven't fully yet cracked what it is that we can do to reduce that risk. Thinking practically for patients around that risk, we do know as a profession that we've got a number of things that we can help to educate and advise on, so individually people can reduce their own risk, be that wearing a fresh lens every day from a daily disposable point of view, avoiding sleeping in that contact lens, avoiding water contact. So we can do our best to reduce the modifiable risks that we know about. But yeah, it's one of those areas with a look to the future, more to come. If we could solve the infection risk, that would be fantastic.
And that's been one of my research interests as well. I published a Cochrane review, which is a systematic review of all the data we could find on this topic, specifically the comfort differences between SiHy and hydrogel contact lenses, and also safety. And we actually didn't see any difference as well. So I think we're talking the same language here. And daily disposables probably are more comfortable. My study didn't have enough data on that topic to dive into it, but I really think that makes sense too.
Agree, and there are fewer data points out there, but it's like I say, so logic sort of feels into that feeling a little bit as well. But yes, so, it's interesting when we pull together those larger pieces of work, like your meta-analysis, the Cochrane review that you're talking about that you did. It really helps us, I think, just with our own understanding as a profession, right? What is true. What do we, what's anecdotal or what's a misheld belief? And which is also why I think moments like that Cochrane report, like this literature review, are really helpful just to kind of pull it all together into one place as a summary for people to read.
I love that. We need to get away from anecdotal stuff. So the reason I came up with my research topic is maybe in 2010, the American Optometric Association asked me to write an article on why hydrogels were better than SiHys. And back then I'm like, oh, I'm just going to get roasted for writing this paper. And it came out that maybe they're not superior. Like there's maybe some situations where hydrogels are good for people and SiHys are good for other people. And, today's topic is SiHys, and I think they're amazing, but we can't forget about, the other stuff that we can have for prescribing to our patients.
Totally agree. And that's the truth of the matter, right? The key point around silicone hydrogels right now is the removal of limitations on wear time and of concerns around the hypoxic signs that come through overwear. And because a lot of development has happened, both from materials from manufacturers and then optical designs within the silicone hydrogel space, we also really have the newer developments that are coming out on that family of materials. So we have greater choice in that kind of area as well. So I think that also helps to explain why we're very frequently reaching into that silicone hydrogel pot to fit our patients. But the freedom to wear lenses for long hours is absolutely key for our patients. But yes, from a research point of view, we continue to need to work on some of those other aspects just to improve things if we can.
Yeah. Hydrogels probably will get left behind at some point. Like you said, your company and many others, I think, are focusing on adding their newest, coolest stuff to SiHy platforms. So I think that's probably where we're going to end up one day.
We certainly see that trend. We do also still see in the fitting data from things like the International Prescribing Report, in pockets, very consistent use of hydrogel materials, and for some of the good reasons that we've just discussed.
Well, we're going to be closing out this podcast here soon, but I got one general question left for you. So if you look at international prescribing, it varies widely from one country to another for SiHys. So maybe you could elaborate on that a little bit for our listeners, because the Academy is a global organization and we want to include everyone.
It's fascinating, isn't it? I can sit here and say there's an average of sort of 70% of daily disposables overall that are fit inside of silicone hydrogel materials, and it's about 80% on average in the reusables reaching for silicone hydrogel. But you're quite right, we get these very large variations in overall use. And we go, most recently in the report that's just been released this January, we go from some countries and some markets in the 90s of how often they're reaching for silicone hydrogel materials compared to hydrogel, through to there's one market in the world that's down in the 20s, so it's about 24% of the time they're reaching for silicone hydrogel. So we have wide variation that we're aware of. I think for me, a lot of that plays into historical fitting habits and the way that contact lenses have been fit in the past. When I look at my own personal experience of fitting and working in the United Kingdom, we were quite early on, and I think in general earlier, leaning into daily disposables than, for example, the US market. So, as daily disposables were coming in, and then as silicone hydrogel daily disposables were coming in, you've sort of got a bit of a faster start into fitting and refitting into that, into those lenses, into that material. When you look into other markets, and so the US is for many years now has been on that change and that curve, heading out of reusables a little bit more of that convenience and health benefits of daily disposables. But you just see that sort of just difference in where did they start and how is that changing over time. One of the interesting ones for me is some markets that are slightly more developing over time, maybe entered into using contact lenses on a regular basis a little later on as a whole market. Actually, in some of those cases, those are the examples that are very heavily just into silicone hydrogels. That was probably the thing that was around most commonly for them at the time, and it becomes very very easy to reach. With Finland as an example, I think we sort of consistently see very high use of silicone hydrogels.
Maybe some of the more senior docs in some countries are just hanging on to the old thing and they don't want to change. So, like you said, maybe in markets where this is something newer, they just jump to that first.
It just becomes the first thing that you use, right? And to your point, changing a patient, and that's a whole. We could have a whole other podcast on, that kind of lifetime of wear, on keeping patients in the most appropriate lens as they go through their life. We could have a whole podcast that we talk about dropout and how do we address that, and have we got the right lenses? Is it around the way that we're interacting with our patients and being proactive about moving them? So that there are many other kind of variables around that kind of help to describe why we get different levels of use and success out of these.
I think I'm gonna have to have you back to talk about contact lens dropout sometime. We both love that topic.
I would love to.
So I guess with that, do you have any take-home points or closing thoughts for our listeners on this topic?
I think we've covered the majority of it. Thank you, Andrew. But we recognise through this literature review a couple of areas that would be nice to push on in terms of technology in the future, certainly around infections, certainly around, is there an opportunity to make lenses even more comfortable for wearers in general, or maybe those who are symptomatic. So clearly across the industry, work is ongoing to continue to push the boundaries, push the bar where we can. I would just finish by saying, all things being equal for today's patients, with the choice of optical designs and correction options that we have, with the choice of different variations of silicone hydrogel materials, all things being equal, reaching for a daily disposable, giving the new lens advantages and reduced complication rate, plus the oxygen benefits of a silicone hydrogel material, putting those together. So a one-day silicone hydrogel is often going to be, the most obvious starting point for many patients.
Awesome. Well, thanks for being here today.
Thank you.
And I'd like to thank you all for tuning in to this episode of the Clinical Podcast series. We hope to see you again soon. Thank you.